Hi there, good evening. You are with the Urban Debate tonight. I'm Seher Zama. The TRAI today, which is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India under the Government of India, wants to know whether OTT services, these are over-the-top services such as WhatsApp, FB Messenger, Skype, Hike, WeChat, all of these services that we use for direct communication, even for direct calls sometimes, should be regulated. There's a question being raised on why not regulate these services. The Indian telcos are crying foul because these OTT services are eating into their business. There is also a question of security of data on these services. So what should be the essential concern of the government? The convenience of the Indian consumer? Because at the end of the day, using these services is extremely convenient to us. It's a question of convenience. Should that be the government's concern or the TRAI's concern? Or should it be a concern to help Indian telcos profit? Should we look at regulations all the time? How about also looking at reforms of the existing services of the Indian telcos? That's what we're discussing tonight.
On the debate tonight, the Telecom Regulator of India, TRAI, is now mulling regulation of net-based communication apps like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Hike, Viber, among others, and OTT platforms as well.
The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India believes that there should be a set of rules that should be guiding players like WhatsApp, Facebook, and Google. They believe that increasingly the lines have blurred between the kind of services that are being provided by Indian service providers and the kind of services that are being provided by these platforms.
The government says it's planning to regulate social media in a bid to clamp down on fake news and to explore the costs and benefits of regulating social media. We asked urban citizens if they want government to regulate apps like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger.
उसमें अगर कोई रेगुलेशन या कुछ लगता है तो मेरे लिए तो ये बेकार की चीज़ है। एज अ कंज्यूमर तो हम यही चाहेंगे ना कि लिमिटेड चीज़ों में हमें जितना फ़ायदा हो सके वो हमें मिले।
अगर इस पे कोई रोक लगती है तो मैं उसके अगेंस्ट जाऊंगा, क्योंकि मुझे लगता है कि जो चीज़ मुझे सस्ते में मिल जाए मैं उसे क्यों पैसे दे के लूँगा।
I don't think there is any problem in doing if they want to regulate it or if they want to make any sort of framework for this. I don't think there is any problem in this.
Government has also called for public suggestions and objections to the draft. These need to be sent in by December 10th and December 24th respectively. Mirror now asks, should India regulate communication apps? Let's debate.
All right, let's throw this open to our panelists tonight. Let's try to understand better what is really meant by regulation, and should we always look at regulation on plenty of services that are provided to us by other companies. Gopal Agarwal, spokesperson of the BJP with us. Nikhil Pehva, editor of Media Nama. Ravi Viseswarya Prasad, telecom consultant and expert with us. Abhimanyu Radhakrishnan, journalist. RJ Abhi from Radio Mirchi. Dr. Manish Kumar, who is the assistant professor at the Ramaiah Institute of Technology. Let's get in a word here from Mr. Ravi Viseswarya first. Ravi, in your view, yes, to what extent is this regulation a compromise on the convenience that is provided to the Indian consumer? Is this regulation largely being misunderstood by youngsters, or is regulation for our good?
Well, I believe that there should be as little regulation as possible. That is an ideological belief of mine. Now, here we have to see that what the interests of the consumers have become paramount, and the interests of the consumers require that they have access to these over-the-top services such as WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. Now the question arises of a level playing field between the telecom operators or the access providers. And this debate has been going on not just in India, but all over the world. It's been going on in US and Europe for several years. And there is no easy solution because you have very powerful corporate interests on both sides. And no matter what decision you take, you are going to end up hurting the interests of some very powerful business interests who are politically powerful. Now, the debate essentially is that you have licensed services, which are the telecom operators and the internet service providers, who have to pay a heavy license fee, which amounts to which in India for the telecom operators amounts to almost 34%. Now you have these over-the-top players who are using the infrastructure of the telecom operators and are offering unlicensed services which compete with the licensed services provided by the telecom operators or the internet service providers, such as messaging apps cut into the SMS revenue. Now, it's good for the consumers. The consumers should have a choice. The consumers should have the chance to use services which
that's right. But Ravi, should this still should these services free by alternate platforms still be coming under the ambit of a license? Because if they're technically not a telecom company but are providing those services as an added advantage, should they still require that license?
Well, I believe a sort of via media should be found. They should not be treated as telecom operators. They should be treated as over-the-top service providers. But what my recommendation would be is to lower the licensing burden on the telecom operators. The ones, see, the problem arose because in 1994, when you came up with these telecom licenses, nobody had ever envisaged a time when you would have a WhatsApp, which came 20 years later, or a Facebook Messenger, which all came up in the mid 2000s or late 2000s. So your telecom regulation has got to actually be retrospectively drafted to make a level playing field. And instead of regulating the telecom, the over-the-top players, my recommendation would be to lower the regulatory burden and the compliance burden and the revenue outflow for the licensed telecom operators and the ISPs. The ISPs all got licensed in the 1990s. So when nobody envisaged that you would have voice over internet protocol where you'd have video calling over WhatsApp. So now a video call over WhatsApp cuts into what the projections that the telecom operators had made 25 years ago as what their license revenues, would be. So it cuts into their business plans, and for which they had paid a huge license fee and spectrum charges. So you have to level the kind of very unequal playing field between the two.
All right. So you're saying that it's only fair that you have these telecom companies today complaining about these OTT services to begin with, the license that they didn't pay for. RJ Abhi, would you agree with that? Should the TRAI or the concerned ministry, the IT ministry of the government, be looking at regulating these added services which are quite like perks for us now as consumers? Should we not be looking at reforms in the existing Indian telco services then?
Well, from a consumer's perspective, there are two things that would matter the most. There is cost and then there is convenience. Now, if we have some form of regulation on board, of course, there will be concerns about privacy. There will be concerns about where is this information being sent. And what I think matters most to the consumer is the convenience of a platform. Now, if this regulation in any way inhibits the usage of a platform, if people find it to be some form of an inconvenience, then they will not spend a lot of time in migrating to another platform. So how many different platforms is this regulation going to play catch up with? Now, if it is designed to curb the spread of fake news, as the TRAI report goes, so in that case, wouldn't it make sense instead of a top-down approach to have a bottom-up approach in basically reaching out to people so that they're not encouraged to spread fake news in the first place, right? So in this case, I believe the consumer will move to a different platform the moment they feel that their convenience or their cost is being jeopardized in any form.
Gopal Agarwal, is it just about protecting the business of Indian telcos here? Because they've complained about it, they've raised this issue, they say that they're eating into our profit, they're hampering our business, we've paid so much for the licenses. Should we also look at upgrading our own system within the Indian telecoms, upgrading services within the Indian telecoms? Because this argument of security concern or data protection or personal information protection here, you have systems within the Indian telecoms which are vulnerable, as vulnerable to being hacked into.
I think this is the only reason that we should look into this regulation in a larger perspective. Just because some of the Indian telecom operators are feeling the pinch for the profitability into their balance sheet because of these services, that should not be the criteria for justification of regulation. The regulation has to be based on much larger issues with regard to data protection, with regard to information to be provided to the investigation agencies, with regard to our data getting out to the countries not part of India. The most important thing in the future will be the amount of data that is generated from India. That's the biggest asset that can be created. If that data which is being created on all this is not the property or is not belongs to the Indian territory or domain, that will be a big loss to the country. So that is one thing. Second thing is the investigative agencies, their access to them. And third is the foreign countries getting access to some of the information through this on this data. These are the three important issues. And another issues are concerns about the fake news being circulated, easy accessibilities, cost issues with regard to generation of fake news.
No, but there's so many Indian portals circulating fake news as well. Have we acted against them?
Etc.
Mr. Gopal, there's so many Indian portals here.
That doesn't mean that if there is something
circulating fake news, instigating a certain group of people. WhatsApp was taken to task as well. That, of course, has been brought into reducing messages only in a group of 20 people here. But there's a lot of information, questionable information circulating in the existing setup of Indian services. Is the government acting in against those as passionately? Is the government seeking out reforms in that as passionately as you have the TRAI in wanting to do this research?
No, but we should understand that if we are talking of autonomy of regulatory authorities, then any decision or any discussion paper or consultation paper they bring to the public notice should not be taken as a government view. I am not talking on a government view. I am talking on what TRI consultation paper has been put into the public domain. And it's an independent body, autonomous body, and it is not taking action. It has put that paper for consultation for people to come out with their issues, and finally they will come out with the regulation. That's very important. This is a concern area. Various aspects and stakeholders have to give their opinion. After assimilating all the information, then TRAI will take a call. But I think that regulation is
Nikhil
required.
Pahwa, do you agree with that?
Objective of regulation has to be different. Yes.
So look, Seher,
all right, regulation is required to an extent is what you're saying. Nikhil Pahwa, would you agree with that?
Yeah. Look, Seher, I don't even know why we're discussing fake news over here, because that is not the jurisdiction of the TRAI. It can't even be considered in this paper. What is worrying for me about this paper is that the TRAI is looking at this paper as a means of regulating the internet. What we're looking at here is the potential license raj for the internet for services like audio, video, which are mentioned in the paper, services like messaging and communications, which are integral to the internet. Every single service that you use today has a component of messaging. There are millions of messaging apps. There are games in which players can message each other. How much will they regulate? What all will they regulate? And will regulation then be used as a means of killing all the opportunities users have of trying different things on the internet? Secondly, this looks like a backdoor means of internet licensing using telecom regulation. The TRAI Act does not allow it to look at the internet. This phrase OTT is a misnomer. Everything on the internet is OTT. Telecom is just an access service provider. The internet is basically independent of telecom operators. We use it to go wherever we want, to use whichever services we want. So if you want to license WhatsApp, if you want to license messaging, you are basically trying to license the internet here. As a user, I'm using a telecom operator as an access service provider. then the point that was made about
Okay, so
revenue losses for the
Nikhil, do you
telecom
feel
operators,
this is just another step forward with respect to net neutrality? Which the government and the TRAI had faced immense protests in the year 2015 against net neutrality. In the heat of that, the government decided to do away with it, shoot down those suggestions by Facebook and Airtel on net neutrality. Do you think this is just another attempt to that?
But no, this is a continuation of that paper, but I just want to address one important point. I looked up Airtel's revenues in Q2 2016 versus Airtel's revenues now. Revenues have grown, profits have grown. So I don't understand what this problem is. If there has been a decline in SMS revenue or there has been a decline in voice revenue, which there hasn't, it has more than been addressed by increase in data revenues. There is a competition currently in the telecom service between Jio and all the others. And therefore, this has nothing to do with the internet. This argument that you need to, support them because they're losing revenue, etc., is just bunkum. We let them sort out their competition problems themselves.
No, this is what I'm just opposing.
This has nothing to do. This has nothing to do with the internet.
This should not be the criteria for regulation.
The internet is not.
Right. No. Gopal Agarwal, I'm going to come to you in just a bit. Let's also get in a word here from Dr. Manish Kumar. Dr. Manish, you feel that regulation is required, but is this a smokescreen that we're dealing with? The real purpose of this paper is something else.
Yeah, actually, I was a bit shocked and surprised when I read that whole paper, and what I found that TRI main objective is for the profitability and sustainability for the service provider. So I was thinking that country will come up with the regulations for privacy, security, and other aspects, whereas other countries are talking on that, they are debating on those topics, whereas the TRI, I understand that TRI is more related to the telcos profits and their rules and regulations. So they are more interested on the profit side of the telcos, not other issues. But what I want to raise one thing, that regulation is required. I will say that anything which start controlling your society must be controlled by the system before it become too late. So social media is controlling your society today, and if you don't have any regulations to control it, definitely you have to face adverse effect. So obviously regulation is required, but what I am shocked to see that this regulation is more towards the profitability of the telcos, not about other concern which is paramount like national securities or privacies or other issues which we need to take care.
Right.
So I think
which
we
should
have
be of larger
to
concern.
debate on those topics, and we have to have a balance of all those things. I think that other aspects are more important than the profitability.
I need to take in a word here from Abhimanyu Radhakrishna as well. Abhimanyu, what is your understanding of what the TRAI aims to achieve if at all it decides to bring about this regulation?
It's very clear from at least this particular consultation paper, because it specifically talks only about OTTs versus TSPs, and I agree with Nikhil. This term OTT, you'll never see it being used in an internet industry forum. Zuckerberg or even Jan Kumar, WhatsApp never refer to themselves as OTTs. This is a telecom industry term basically used to refer to everything else, which is the internet. So, if you're going to use the term OTT, I would say, why not call the telecom operators, I don't know, under the bottom or UTB or pipes? Because as Nikhil said, that is what they are. They are pipes to provide us these services. Of course, what's happened, as one of the panelists said, is that when these pipes went wireless, they had to pay these really high fees, and sort of the implicit understanding was that they could do whatever they wanted once they had paid that license for the spectrum, and whatever that wanted included things like the zero rating, which was pushed back with net neutrality laws, and basically create these walled gardens. Now, there's very little sympathy, I must say, for telecom operators from consumers and users like me, because people who remember growing up in 2003 to 2009, when telecom operators actually did have control over the entire ecosystem. Remember this cringe-worthy experience called VAS, or value-added services, which was horrible for users to use. It was a rip-off. Even the provider providers of the services would never get their payments in time for the telecom operators. So I must say telcos, lost their entire, the faith or their standing in that entire ecosystem. And then, nobody wanted to give them a chance, despite the fact that, to be fair to them, now the so-called OTT players, or the big five from Silicon Valley, actually dwarf the telecom guys in size. 15 years ago, when Google was pushing for net neutrality, they were a small Silicon Valley startup pushing against the big guys. Today, the big five internet companies can easily, acquire each of these telecom companies many times over. So the danger actually is that tomorrow, suppose a Google or a Facebook acquires a telecom company and then says, hey, we should be able to, only give preference to Google.
Are you saying this is a survival issue for Indian telecos? What other countries internationally have done, instead of entirely doing away or bringing about regulation, are looking at providing an equal playing field to these OTTs. Abhi, would you agree with that? That this is, at the end of the day, just another phase of net neutrality in a twisted manner, as Nikhil was saying here, and controlling content and
and net neutrality, frankly, it's not a legal or a technical issue as much as a philosophical issue, because it's how you define freedom of speech. China has a fully closed internet and they're doing very well both. They're able to handle it technically. They've got great startups. I think ByteDance last month became the most valuable internet startup. So you can handle it, but the point is, as a country, how do you want your internet to be? Do you want it to be free access?
The government of India providing these OTT services. All right, but I'm not sure we can shoot these down entirely as illegal.
I mean, it's so ridiculous because it's not executable. How will you do it?
But Abhi, in your understanding and the views that you've heard from each of our panelists here, Abhi, do you feel that this is just a question of scratching the surface and finding perhaps another intent to what is being presented here?
See, I mean, as far as finding another intent goes, I can speak from my perspective as a user of these services that anytime... See, every time...
I'll have to specify, RJ Abhi, please go ahead. That wasn't for you, Abhimanyu, that was for RJ Abhi.
Oh... So I just like to say, from a consumer's perspective, what matters most is, are my concerns being addressed? Now, do I have the privacy to communicate or to create the kind of content I want to on a particular platform? Now, as far as these services go, as they're labeled as OTT services, the internet is the great communication equalizer across the world. I mean, like, China has its own closed internet, I agree. But there is an undercurrent, there is also a dark internet operating in China that does reach out to our internet as well. People are aware that there are differences, and I believe that's the purpose of the internet, to show everybody what's happening in the different corners of the globe so that we can all come to a more equitable platform. Now, if in this case the regulation is something that is trying to stop something like that from happening, it's going to have a very tough time, because consumers are simply going to move towards where they find the kind of content they want. Now, if people are being stopped from doing that, they will find ways and means of doing it. That's why whole services of VPNs and the dark web exists. So, what my only concern remains is that if there is going to be a regulation, is there going to be transparency? Will people know what is being regulated? To what extent is being regulated? Like, their concerns, where is my data going? Now, in these days, it has become a concern, right? And through the regulation of services like these, it could, through video and everything, it could extend into the online domain very easily. Now, this is where it becomes a point of concern, because the consumer is not going to care. They're simply going to go for the option that is the most cost effective and the most convenient for them and gives them the kind of content they want.
Right. Nikhil, help us understand why this extreme reaction, so to say, with respect to what the TRAI is attempting to do, just to get a few facts on record here, just to make the system more workable, because there are countries across the world, Indonesia, France, Germany, the UK, the European Union, came up all alike with the same issue, concerns regarding OTT and how this needs to be regulated, how this needs to be brought into a same platform and providing them licenses. Why is there such an extreme reaction if you have the TRAI doing this in India with the same concern? There are other governments of other far more developed nations wanting to do the same. Because at the end of the day, these are services which are also encrypted, which you can't break into if required on issues of national security.
So let me first address something which many panelists have talked about the need for regulation of so-called OTT, which are social media apps, messaging apps. Video is also included, by the way, right? They are all already regulated. We have an act called the IT Act which regulates them. There are over 79 sections in that IT Act which regulate each and every one of these services. So to say that there is no regulation is frankly completely wrong. There is what you need to remember is that this consultation paper is very specifically about licensing. It is not about regulation because regulation already exists. There is also regulation regarding encryption from different regulators. So the RBI mandates a high degree of encryption for its services. In telecom, what happens is that the messaging services
No, but
have a very low
Nikhil,
degree of
licensing
regulation,
also
which is
brings in
problematic.
regulation.
No, but regulation already exists. Seher.
Nikhil, let's
There is a
also
full act of Parliament
also
regulating these
talk in
things.
terms that the viewer can also understand here. Let's talk in simpler terms,
Yeah, yeah.
Nikhil.
There is-
Licensing will also bring
look,
about regulation, no?
No, licensing will basically just allow the government to allow or disallow an app from or a service from functioning in India, and they might take some revenue from those apps. This is only about money. This is about access. Every other aspect that you're talking about over here is already covered under the IT Act. So let's be very clear. This is about just getting a license and bringing in a license, Raj, and making money off it. Nothing else.
Mr. Gopal Agarwal, your response to this?
I have a one
this is the
concern
crux
in
of the
that.
issue. This is what it boils down to.
I
wanted to add
want
one
to say
point
is
in that.
that when people say that this is for regulating only for the economic considerations, then I would like to mention that if it is only economic consideration, then this kind of regulation is not required. The second thing is, when you are talking of regulation, it is not 360-degree regulation that everything will be regulated. It should be specific areas which require regulation, which has to be regulated, and which are required at present time that has to be regulated. One thing is that every kind of service provider in the field which comes under the regulatory aspect of that regulator has to be regulation. How much is the depth of regulation? What is the quantum of regulation? How it is to be regulated? That's for the regulator to decide. But everybody providing service into that area or domain has to come under the regulatory aspect of the regulator, because that regulator has the responsibility of maintaining the overall domain, overall ecosystem into that field. So that's very important. Then the regulator will decide what area have to be regulated, and only economic consideration cannot be the basis of regulation. And the fourth important point is that data is an important ownership of the data, and misuse of data has to be under the investigative agencies and the domestic control of the country, or for that matter the regulator, because foreign countries having access to domestic data is not right thing,
but
and
that is
Indian
not a part of
government
this
or
regulation,
Indian
sir.
regulator
This
should
is
have control
regulation
over how
of
that data is
personal data is
regulated.
not a
Those
part
who
of
are
this
talking of
regulation.
Okay,
China,
let's get in let's get in another view on what regulation means. Nikhil, this is just your understanding. Because the TRAI has also very clearly defined what OTT means, not necessarily the internet that you're insisting here. So let's also get an alternate understanding of what this paper really means, apart from just your view and your understanding that this is really attacking the internet. Dr. Manish, you wanted to come in at this point.
Yeah, I wanted to say something that once you are talking about the regulating all this, one thing will happen that it will start licensing for again, and that will start licensing RAS. And what will affect that? The small player, the small startup which want to come in with the new kind of service or apps, then what type of TRA rules regulation is there that will hurt them. So we have to see all those aspects. Just making a regulations will not solve the issue. It will have reverse effect also.
Sir,
so that is one thing
agencies
that
are
your
not
ecosystem will
profit-making
spoil,
companies.
and that small. But this
let
regulating
Dr. Manish
agency,
complete his point.
what
These
they are
regulating,
bringing, they are trying to make
authorities are
profit.
not profit-making companies. No, you see,
But
SEBI
they
has
are
done
trying
a
to
lot.
the
make the
allegation you're being that
profit.
you're helping the
All are
Indian telecoms,
regulated
certain
by
Indian telcos
independent
here, to be making more money.
They are funded by the government.
Really?
No, if
Mr.
they
Mr.
are
Ravi
having an
Prasad,
objective
my
of
what do you
point
make of
making
this?
is, if you
money
bring
Mr.
such
Ravi
kind
Prasad,
of
what do you make of
regulations,
this?
what
The
happens?
exact
Then
understanding
they
of
are
what
not
is the real
regulator.
intention of this paper, of this research by the TRI?
Well, my personal view is that we should have
So
a laissez-faire situation where the consumer decides what he wants, and there should be as little regulation as possible or greatly no regulation, because what we have seen over the last 30 years in the telecom sector from all countries, that if you, whatever regulations you make, they end up having unforeseen consequences, and many times the regulations you make today turn out to be very counterproductive 10 years from now, which is what has happened in this present case. So here we have a situation which governments all over the world are trying to come up with this dilemma of how to balance the interests of the consumer versus the interests of the OTT players versus the interests of the telcos. Now there is not a level playing field between the new entrants, which are the OTT players, and the telcos, and my suggestion would be lower the regulatory barrier on the telcos. Whatever regulations you have made which control the telcos, please lighten those. Whatever money they have paid in terms of license fees and spectrum fees, lower that as much as possible. Right now they're paying 34%. Lower that to 1%. Keep the license fee as just an administrative kind of charge. There is no reason why you can't lower the license fee from 34% to 1%. And then, and since the over-the-top players are really having a kind of revenue run. Now, even the traditional telcos have a dilemma between two departments of theirs. On the one hand, they want the OTT players because the subscribers come for the OTT players. The subscribers come for content. Nobody gets on the internet just like that. They get on the internet to go to Google or WhatsApp or Facebook. Okay, so they want that data revenue from the access. On the other hand, they had paid huge license fees on the presumption that they would have a protected market for 20 years, that they would have a voice market for 20 years.
Right.
And what happens is that Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp Messenger or Telegram voice calls cut into their projected revenue for which they had paid a license fee in the anticipation of having a protected market for the next 20 years. So what you have to do
All right, so it's reducing the burden for Indian telcos. Should be working the other way around instead of the operations of the OTTs. Abhimanyu, you wanted to come in because the OTTs that have also been named here by the TRA are essentially intermediaries of international companies. We don't have the Indian OTT providers yet under the scanner.
Wait, that's a secondary discussion. I wanted to respond to first, the license fee lowering explanation. When you say that somebody has paid a license fee because they expect 20 years of voice service, that's basically saying that we invested in a fixed deposit. But this is not a fixed deposit. When you take an investment call, you've taken an investment call in technology. When VCs take a bad investment call, they lose their investments. When shareholders take an investment call that goes wrong, there's a very big risk. So why should the taxpayer, which is you and I who get the license fee comes to the government, why should the taxpayer subsidize a bad long-term technology call that players took? Yes, there is a legal issue that was it implicit when the license condition was given that would always have control over the entire spectrum? I don't think so.
Revenues have grown.
Yeah.
No, revenues have grown, profits have grown.
There was regulation that was equal for everybody, but just because telecom companies did not anticipate
Nikhil, would you like to respond to that?
What telecom operators lose on the swings, they gain on the roundabouts from the data. Okay.
Subsidy back to the telecom operator, the shareholders should take the loss.
This is getting very complicated, really, for even the viewer to understand. This is getting very twisted. Nikhil, just to really break this down.
In 1994, the telecom operators didn't invest in a free market. They invested in a monopolistic market where they were guaranteed only limited competition. Okay.
Then the Indian telcos need to be doing a better job of providing services, which is why we're shifting to the OTTs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nikhil, go ahead.
In my view, the consumer interest requires OTTs, and OTTs should be encouraged. I strongly encourage OTTs, and there should be minimal regulation on OTTs because number one, you can't regulate them technologically. Number two, you end up with international conflicts of laws.
Absolutely, the intermediaries, they can't be regulated.
Backfire. Just have a laissez-faire situation.
So Nikhil, is this really turning into reforms and improvement of services of Indian telcos instead of pulling down on the OTTs?
No, look, I don't even know why this consultation has come because frankly, telecom operators, they are in a highly competitive scenario right now. Jio has come and disrupted the market completely. Many telcos have shut down because of that. But even in spite of that, revenues have grown for the Indian telecom operators. If there's a short blip right now, it is not the government's mandate to help them, with their business models. Markets will expand, markets will contract. In 2008, when the 2G licenses scam happened, those licenses were given. Market expanded, Tata Docomo came in, prices dropped. At that time, no one was complaining. Why is this complaint coming now? Look, telco revenues have grown. Data has more than covered for any losses they might have had. Video consumption has gone for Idea Cellular is more than 8 times year on year. That's so much data is being consumed. People want more data. At this point in time, if you're going to start licensing video, you're going to start licensing messaging, it's going to lead to a market contraction. We need these services to bring more people online. It would go against Digital India for any kind of regulation coming in, any kind of licensing coming in.
It will go against Digital India. Fair pointed out there. This could in fact be going against what has been one of the government's pet projects, which is exactly what was spoken about in net neutrality. The very concept of net neutrality was going against Digital India. That's well pointed out, Nikhil. Let's take in a viewer. We have Ms. Nicola, one of our viewers calling in from Switzerland. Nicola, is my voice going through? Please go ahead.
Ms. Zaman, it's so nice to talk to you. I love your channel.
What I want to say...
Thank you very much.
And I think this time, Mr. Nikhil Parwa is hitting the nail on the head. It's all about selling data. It's just that. I mean, is it about you regulating the content? Because your topic is it about regulating content of these apps or is it about regulating pricing? And I think it's all about selling data. And in fact, in Switzerland also, they're not allowed to, charge for such services. You're basically paying for the internet. So now you can sell your data for 100 megabytes, you can sell it for 1 giga, you can sell it for unlimited, and so on and so forth. And the internet is then open because all of these apps are free.
Okay. We appreciate you calling you in there from Switzerland and in understanding this in the Indian context. And this is as much a global context. This is not specifically an Indian context here. You have a viewer who's called in from Switzerland explaining the same issue and understanding the issue very clearly. Gopal Agarwal, you will have to respond to this. This is about making money. Is this about the government wanting to make money over the OTT services?
No, if it is about the pricing, then I think regulation is not required because it is in the competitive market. It is a market which should decide the pricing and other profitability of any venture or not. And there is entry and exit process in the whole economic scenario ecosystem, and the government should not get into regulating pricing or regulating profitability of companies, and the regulator should also desist on regulating on the prices. Only if the content and other issues, security concerns are there, then only there should be regulation. Otherwise, the consumer is the king, and it is OTT have all
right. So, Mr. Gopal Agarwal, wouldn't it have been better?
Everybody has used.
Wouldn't it have been better if you have a government body mulling over more on the menace of content which is disrupting society, more on the menace of fake news?
That's the point we raised at the beginning, that privacy, security and other issues are paramount.
Can you repeat? Right. Yes, Yes, Mr. Gopal, that question for you here. Wouldn't the government be instilling more faith in the system here
can you
if there is a
repeat that?
concern on dealing with the menace of fake news? Yes, that's what I've done.
Yes. No, this is not the fake news only which is the concern. The issue is the data protection, the ownership of the data, and how to use it, and passing on that information to the investigative agency if it is required, and the security of data from the foreign countries. You see, if you are comparing with China, how much protected environment they are creating for their data. We cannot compare with China. We are an open country. They are quite close with regard to access of information with regard to their data. So data is a big asset for any country. And second is the ownership, and the if we are going to the future, artificial intelligence, data mining, all these issues will create a big wealth for any economy, and we have to take control of that data, which can create big wealth for our country. So these are important aspects, and misuse of platform is also an important aspect. How much depth of regulation is required is for the regulatory authority, but if only the pricing is the concern, profitability of telecom service provider is concerned, I don't think the regulation is required. And we have seen in the internet also.
Okay, so that's nice to hear, Mr. Gopal Agarwal. So in one go, you have quite literally shot down what the TRA, the TRI attempts to find out here in this study. You're actually shooting down what the TRI wants to find out and figure in this study there.
Okay, just a second.
Seher, if I may.
Yeah, Seher? Yeah, okay. On fake news.
Okay, all right, yeah. Let's have Dr. Manish step in on this. Dr. Manish, if we've established at least one thing here, that the intent of this study by the TRI is just about knowing how to nab the OTTs. Let's use that word, to nab these OTTs, which are intermediaries, which are hugely popular with the Indian consumer, and you have the government feeling pretty helpless about it.
Yeah, I agree with the other speaker that we need to care about the privacy, surveillance, security, and the data security of your country. In that respect, obviously, we need to regulate the service provider. If you look at the TRI paper, it's talk more about the big player of the apps. So, and they control the huge amount of data of your country about individuals. So, some regulatory must require. But again, as other speaker told that, if it is only in terms of profit, then this regulation is not required. If you are talking with the other aspect which is much important for the national security, then definitely regulation is required, and we all should support. I suggest that, see, convenience and cost of the customer at the cost of national security can never be accepted. You have to have a balance. Some regulation is required to control it, but obviously not for the cost. If I have already paid for internet services, that also goes to telecom company, and again I am paying for the app services, then I don't think it's make any sense. Right. So regulation is required, but not only for the profit making, for other aspects.
Yes, Dr. Manish, you've put that across very well. We're already paying for our internet services. Why pay extra for the OTTs here? RJ Abhi, do we have a better understanding with respect to what India is facing as far as OTT is concerned, and what the other countries have done? You have governments of other countries which are in the same spot here.
Yes, definitely. I mean, see, the whole point is the internet or these OTT services basically allow people to experience communication and content in a way that earlier technologies did not. Now, why is a service like WhatsApp more popular than the SMS services of old? Simply because it provides the customer with more cost efficiency and more convenience. So that is what they will want. Now, I completely understand Sir's point when he says that there needs to be a balance.
And the entirely free services.
Who is the arbiter? Who decides what that balance is? Exactly. There are countries where the internet is treated as a basic utility. Now, are we moving to strengthening our infrastructure so that it's not our existing infrastructure, so it's not vulnerable to attacks? Shouldn't that be a more prime cause of concern? Because as we hear and see, there are a lot of data breaches happening all across the world. So this security is something that I believe should be focused on rather than regulating the content, because you can't really blame the platform for the way people are using it. I mean, if you really want to curb, let's say, a certain specific kind of content, wouldn't you rather focus on removing the need for its existence first? Right. How is the platform responsible for what I decide to send on it? Where does that
Abhimanyu, on
come
what's
down
at stake
to?
for the consumer here? Because
One
these
point
OTT
I would like to
services are
mention.
entirely free for us right now, and if you have the government pushing for even the OTT services, which are intermediaries buying license from the government of India, they would recover that cost from us. So this becomes a paid service for us then as well.
No, not necessarily. Actually, tomorrow the big OTT or internet companies might just do a great deal with the telecom operators, like Facebook was doing with free basics, and actually give you internet even cheaper. It's highly likely that they may tempt consumers into doing something that's against their long-term interest by saying, hey, if you use only the Google ecosystem, it's free on Jio. If you use only the Facebook ecosystem, it's free on Aircel. You can do any sort of combinations, because remember, here there's no good and bad. Both parties are very powerful, the OTT players and the telecom operators. So in the short run, consumers might actually quote unquote benefit in that they might get even more stuff free or even get paid for doing it, but in the long term they lose on choice and they lose on genuine options, which
nothing is free on the internet.
Do you want to be a market like China where the choices are limited, or do you want consumers to be able to decide who are the best and give opportunity to small startups that may not have the money to be able to pay off the big telecom companies?
Right. Gopal Agarwal, would you be informing the government here
I believe
that the
no
TRAI's
service is free on
introduction here with respect to this finding is an entirely bad idea? Because this is typically, Mr. Gopal Agarwal, this is typically playing out the way the issue of net neutrality played out, and Nikhil is going to agree with me on this. This is exactly how the issue of net neutrality played out till the intention stood exposed. That this is about taking away the free internet from us, the access to free internet, which nobody really owns. And this is what it is turning out to be today as well.
No, if it is that, because sometimes we just confused by the term regulator. Regulator has a dual responsibility of regulating and development of the sector, but sometimes we only consider that regulator is there to contain and control the service provider, but ultimately it is the consumer which has to be taken care of, and these service providers have done good. They have made life easier. They are a part of ease of living of the society. So just to regulate them, just to earn profit out of them should not be the criteria for the regulator. It has to be based on.
Are we really misunderstanding regulation here?
Privacy, ownership, etc.
Regulation means control. Nikhil, is this really about
development? Is a part of
understanding the
regulation.
definition of regulation? Because regulation does largely mean control. You control a certain system in regulating it.
Right. So I just wanted to respond to Mr. Gopal Agarwal because he's raised some important points about privacy and security.
We have seen in the SEBI and other thing, the objective of regulation is for development. No, the objective of regulation should be development.
No, what's the development? What's the development here?
Ultimate, if you see the SEBI example, it is the
but the development of the sector is that you make
the paramount objective.
Once again, you're fighting this in the name of development, Mr. Gopal Agarwal. This is so difficult.
It is the benefit.
You're reducing this to an argument of development versus anti-development. If it's a question of development, you help the Indian telecoms flourish as well. Yeah, Nikhil, all right. Final word to you, Nikhil, on that.
If you go into TRAI objective, if you go into TRAI objective, it is specifically mentioned, it is the consumer service which is
complete your point here on this.
Yeah,
no, this will not be reduced. This will not be reduced to a discussion of development versus anti-development.
And so you know, when you look at, you mentioned data protection and privacy, there's a data protection law that's coming in place. Every other aspect that you're considering, there's already a law in place to consider those. If there is fake news, you have the IT Act which can be implemented in order to address some of these issues. So really, the TRA's remit is in this paper is only from the perspective of monetary health of the mobile operators, and there has no development agenda in this particular paper. Please read the paper. Privacy is not a concern of the TRAI. It is not a part of their remit. It's not a telecom issue. The only telecom issue over here is the health of the telecom operators. Everything else is with different ministries, even law enforcement issues that are raised.
And that has been made clear. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that. Really appreciate our panelists for really thrashing it out on what this consultation paper really means. And what we've effectively concluded here is that you cannot be controlling or regulating the services of the OTT, because that comes in as a huge benefit to the Indian consumer. Instead, what we need to do, as was suggested by one of our panelists, is to upgrade services there being provided by the Indian telecos. Instead of the Indian telecos crying foul that, look, they're eating into our business, they're eating into our profit, you improve your services and let the Indian consumer decide whether to avail of the Indian teleco services or switch to a far easier and an entirely free OTT platform. Thanks for being with us.